Before the spring of 2005, this simple conch shell marked the spot where W. Law is buried on Easter Street in Laurel Grove Cemetery. That was his wish.
I want to go out very quietly, without a whole lot of fanfare. It's my desire that there not even be any funeral, and that I be committed to the earth on the day of my demise. But I think it's important not to have a big ending, but to fill life as best you can with all that you can. And I go with each day doing as best I can for that day.
But the shell might go unnoticed. Mr. Law's memory might be hidden from visitors to the cemetery, a possibility that didn't sit well with Mr. Law's lifelong friend, Reamer Pendergraft, and local activist Velma McKenzie. They chose to do as Mr. Law did and not as he said.
Someone said Mr. Law wouldn't dare be doing anything like that, and that's the truth. He absolutely wouldn't do it for himself, but he would do it for those persons that went ahead of him.
He was a mouthpiece for those that could not speak for themselves. He was a roadmap for those that did not know the way.
Mr. Law's sister, Tessie Law Sanders, and his niece, Michelle, were among his visitors in the fading light of a Sunday afternoon when a granite monument, strong and solid, was revealed to mark the final resting place of a giant in the history of the city and the nation. Savannah's Law, W. Law, in his own words.
W. Law divides his time these days shuttling between the two buildings which hold the history of his people in Savannah, the King Tisdale Cottage and the Beach Institute for African American Studies.
One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
He pauses occasionally from his duties as Savannah's preeminent historian to share his memories with visiting school children of the rigors of the schoolroom that required a Bible verse to be recited by each child.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth.
The very first of the Bible.
Of tough times for workers when pieces of cardboard would be substituted for shoes. Of dignity and purpose being more important than the kind of car that you drive or neighborhood you live in.
Very good, class. Very good.
I was just a young reporter in the city of Savannah when the name W. Law started to work its way into the vocabulary of many of the people. Make no mistake about it, there were as many lined up against that name as there were standing for it. It was the early days of the civil rights movement in Savannah, and people were afraid of change or desegregation or each other. But they all had heard of the name W. Law, and that in itself was a remarkable accomplishment.
But I was raised by a grandmother who would tell us, say, if we don't have anything but bread and water, you eat that, wipe your mouth, and go outside and be somebody.
No event was more central to the development of W. Law and Savannah than the Great Depression of the 30s. It was then that people who couldn't afford meat could eat rice and potatoes 3 times a day, when an out-of-work carpenter would ask to cut your grass in exchange for a breakfast of grits and eggs and coffee. It was a time that was so austere, so bare bones, that it ruined many men, but those not destroyed by the Great Depression were made stronger.
As a small boy in the 30s going along the river docks, I remember many of them being rottened out, and there was a tremendous lessening of commerce on the river. A great number of the buildings had been closed, and much of it as a kid I remembered as being kind of like a haunted area. All of the heavy work, the dirty work, would have been done by black folk. And during the Depression, I saw those jobs all of a sudden become desirable on the part of white people. the street sweeping jobs that had been black jobs were given over to whites. Barely, I think that blacks in some cases were even, the trash collecting positions were even taken away from them in some cases. But many of the very lowest kinds of jobs that blacks had held were taken during the Depression, so it made it. My father, in 1932, died with a leaking heart, with no desire to live. My mother would feed him, would administer to him each morning the pill that the doctor provided for his heart condition. And after he had died, we found all of the pills had been hidden in his bed. That the will to live, because there was just, he had been a mechanic down at the corner of Bay and Abercorn in a garage there in front of what is now Christ Church Parish House. And they turned him off in order to give that mechanic job to a white man. And left my mother with 3 children. I was the oldest at the age of 9. I've had all of the experience. I've worked since I was 10 years old. I've stood in bread lines with my mother to get what Roosevelt was issuing out at the beginning of his administration, sugar and food and flour and things like that. They were hard times, no question about it. We ate out of one pot. My mother worked all day and half the night. She'd leave us in bed to get up in the morning to get ready for school, because she had to be in the white folk house when they got up. And then she'd come away from their house after supper. So we merely saw her when she was leaving and we were getting ready to get out of bed, and when we were about to turn in the night for the night again. But she worked, and it was such a hard life that I vowed that as soon as I became a man, I would sit my mother down and she wouldn't have to work so hard anymore. And I kept that vow.
The hard times of the 30s molded the character of Wesley Wallace Law like no other event could have. Without the incentives of money and wealth, he turned his attention to civic virtues. He became well known as an outstanding Boy Scout and a dependable school leader, pictured here with his second in command, Savannah Alderman Clifford Hardwick. He taught Sunday school under the guidance of his mentor, Dr. Ralph Marr Gilbert, Law's predecessor as head of the local NAACP. But with the gathering clouds of World War II, Mr. Law saw that his duty compelled him to answer the call of one of the nation's great voices.
With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
Even when I went into the war in 43, I believe, I asked for infantry duty for the front line, and I was placed in what was a service battalion in the Air Force. All through the whole equation, blacks have had to prove themselves. We were proving ourselves at the beginning, and we did it in World War I, and thought when we came back that we would have our opportunities to be full-fledged Americans and to participate in the fruits of our country. We were denied it. We went into World War II with the same idea. It was not easy, but we had to fight for a chance to go to the battle lines.
The combined experience of World War II and the Great Depression created a unique leader within W.W. Law. He had learned unselfishness from having little to share, dignity from the honest sweat of his brow, sacrifice from the clear example of his family. All of those traits would come together in the early 60s when W.W. Law would pull himself up by the bootstraps and lead his people towards equality. He was a postman. Now, that's some occupation for a leader. He wasn't a doctor nor a lawyer or anything like that. And that seemed to bother a lot of people. But they may have forgotten that a lot of folks who are good leaders didn't start out with a great deal.
I had prepared myself for service, that's all. Not in the pulpit, not in business, but I had prepared myself for service as a community worker, and the people chose that I would be the leader. It wasn't something that I personally sought. It was a mantle that fell on my shoulders.
And in the 26 years that I served as head of the NAACP, I was opposed only one time in 26 years. I was unanimously elected every time I stood for office, except one year when there was a desire on the part of a professional who said that I was neither a preacher or a doctor, didn't have any kind of title before my name, and they ought to have a leader who had that. But
so what did the people say about that?
Well, they stopped him. That's right. That's right. So that.
It sounds important to be called a leader, but with that importance comes a great deal of risk. And for W.W. Law, only the strongest conviction enabled him to carry out his mission.
I knew that inclusion rather than exclusion should have been the proper beginning of this country under the Constitution. I knew the preamble to, you see, we hold these truths to be self-evident. They're evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We, 200 years, had not commit ourselves to doing just that. And so the civil rights movement, that's what it was all about, to set this country right. And we'd been wrong all of that time. Exclusion is not the way then, nor is it now.
The Watts area of Los Angeles, California exploded in racial violence. More than 1,000 people...
Out of Mr. Law's determination came a strategy for winning the struggle for civil rights, a strategy which avoided the violence and the confrontation that ripped other communities apart.
And all of the disturbances were taking place in the 60s with marches at night and so forth, riots and destruction of property, fires and so forth. 14th Street in Washington, D.C., I remember so well. Just about closed up all the business in Northwest Washington on 14th Street. But we had none of that here. There were some things he did that nobody else could do but him, because he would let everything else go.
The best young people who appeared ever in my whole life were the young people who were part of the protests or the civil rights struggle of the 60s. I have never seen a group of young people who were more committed, who were willing to listen and to benefit by the experience of their elders, and who had the courage to step forth and do what they felt and what we called on them to do.
But W.W. Law's activism, though moderate, still spurred opposition, an opposition that continually challenged his dedication.
As results of my involvement in civil rights, even as a student, those who hired in the school system, and that was the only place for me at that time, did not want a radical, an agitator, teaching. And these were blacks who were allowed to select other blacks to teach in the schools. I was given no offer. A man who was a janitor, an elevator operator in an apartment building, an itinerary preacher, came. He would often stop at the office on his way home. Many times he'd stay there at night with me. And on this night he said, "Mr. Law, you look tired. You go on home and I'll sit here and take care of the office for you." So I went on home, and an hour after I got home,
we got a call that someone had murdered him in the office while he was sitting in the desk where I would have been sitting an hour later if he hadn't relieved me. I really had enough to have a widowed mother who had me as her sole support, and to have her concerned about my safety. And I couldn't add to that with a wife and children. Just having an aged mother that I had to constantly comfort, and in the height of the movement, take the phone out and all that kind of thing, or have an unlisted phone so that she wouldn't get the crank calls and all that type of thing. That couldn't have been, I would not have been able to exist if I had had people who would be worried about my well-beings and would be constantly cautioning me to forget it, to get out of it, and all of this kind of thing. It had to be a situation where I could make the sole decision, and I would not have to ask my wife or the children if it was all right with them. So I had to forego all of that.
The struggle for dignity has started W.W. Law on a new path in recent years, and he is now uncovering the roots of a proud people. We'll do that story when we come back. America is a great melting pot, but we still take pride in our ancestral home and our accomplishments. Just ask a Fogarty about a stout-hearted Irishman or a Salzburger about their determination, or an Englishman about all of the odds that they have to overcome. Until recently, black people did not have access to the triumphs of their past, but now, thanks to W.W. Law, they will.
This is basic. This is one of the earliest black communities in our country, and blacks will never measure up and excel in an integrated society unless they first understand who they are, where they came from, and why we're here, and what we've done after we got here.
W.W. Law's most recent project at the Beach Institute has been to gather the works of Savannah sculptor Ulysses Davis under his roof. Davis, who passed away last year, was a beloved and respected contributor to the black experience.
You get it down like you want it.
With the kind of black experience that has evolved in this area, for it not to be highlighted. For example, when we deal with black Afro-American culture, when we deal with Afro-American culture in America, and to pass up coastal Georgia or in South Carolina, you have not dealt with the subject properly, because the barrier islands along Carolina and Georgia held on to the Africanisms that we brought from the mother country. We held them intact, better here than anywhere else in the country. If anybody wants to look at the slave experience and to realize the kind of strength we brought into the slave experience and how blacks were able to adapt their culture and their gifts that they brought to America, adapt them to Americans' culture, we'll see it here. Only New Orleans is the only other place where there will be a strong Afro-American influence into the culture. It's here. The lead response singing, the Gullah dialect, even when we use English words, we pronounce them in the African manner. All of this is fascinating. Our superstitions, you see, our use of herbs for medicine, all of these kinds of things. The folk tales, all are intact.
The real legacy of WW Law is not to be found in old newspaper clippings or in old newsreels. The real legacy is now imprinted in the minds of young black children who have heroes to aspire to, because another of those heroes made sure they knew of their proud past. When we come back, some closing thoughts from WW Law in his own words. We have discovered a treasure chest of philosophy in our many interviews with WW Law. Arguably, he is probably the most eloquent man in the city of Savannah. Now, I ask you to just, whether you're black or white, I want you to just close your eyes and listen. Listen. Good night, everybody.
That you ought to work for more than just material things, because the material things soon vanish. And I think a favorite portion of mine, scripture, was that portion from Hebrews that says that a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. One of my fifth grade teachers called me to her house one day and said, "My boy, your grandmother would be proud if she was alive today, because I was present when you were born, and she prayed at your birth that you would one day be a leader of your people." But it's quite obvious that I stand on the shoulders of a whole lot of other people who have made sacrifices in this community, black and white. But a man is poor not because he doesn't have money in his pocket. He's poor because he doesn't have enough vision in his head and in his heart. People just ring the money. There's no smile. Yeah. I remember the store when the New Year, and they would ask you about the weather, how the children. We have taken all of the human elements out of so much of our activity that people, even a simple thing like saying good morning when you meet people. I speak sometimes and folks look at you jolted that somebody bothers to even say something. And they're expected, the head of the civil rights struggle, to be living in a better house than I would live in, so that the intimidation, the burning of the cross and what have you would be burnt most of the times in front of the homes of the better class blacks who were living in better houses. There is hardly any white person who has not at some time been benefited by the kindness, the work, or the efforts of blacks. And by the same token, blacks have not in the South accomplished anything without the help of some whites. We ought to recognize that we stand here as results of our a composite contribution. And for me, it's an eternal journey. The civil rights effort began before the 60s, and it's still in vogue, you see.
What about the end of WW Law? If you had the opportunity to write your own epitaph, how would you write it?
I'm attempting to go to the end of my cable tow. I have really not thought about that because, very frankly, I want to go out very quietly without a whole lot of fanfare. It's my desire that there not even be any funeral, and that I be committed to the earth on the day of my demise. But I think it's important not to have a big ending, but to fill life as best you can with all that you can. And I go with each day doing as best I can for that day.